Yo, it's Corey with Real Filmmaking, and today we're going to be talking about story structure. I want to learn how to tell a story. Like the hat, a good friend got it for me. It's pretty sweet if I do say so myself. So the following opinions I am about to share are my own personal thoughts and opinions coming from a certain background of how I learned story structure. There are many schools of thoughts regarding this. There's not necessarily one right or wrong. This is how I approach it. I come from more of a literary criticism background. There's shared commonalities in screenwriting and stuff, but it's not exactly verbatim. But it will give you the principles that I hope to instill, which is being able to tell a story, a coherent, structured story. So let's get into it. So there's lots of different ways to talk about telling stories, like I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to throw a couple little infographics on the screen for you to look at. Shabam! So here you've probably seen at least one of these before. One is your standard literary narrative map of how to tell a story. Another one is more of the film-centric version of how you tell a story. The basic plotting, the outline of how to tell a story in regards to film language is called a 3-act structure. But essentially, the same thing is happening in both. There's just different names for different parts of it. Act 1. So in Act 1 we get what is commonly referred to as the exposition. The exposition consists of telling us who the characters are, telling us where we are, telling us what's going on in the world, why should we care, all that sort of things. Gives us the details that helps kind of bring this movie world to life. Along with the exposition, the first act also kind of helps set the mood of the type of movie that we're watching. So if we're watching a comedy film, we're going to get a lot of those comedic elements up front. Whereas if we're watching something that's a little bit darker or it's a tragedy, we're going to get some of those tragic elements that start to already come through in the first half hour of the film. A thing that is commonly employed in a lot of films in the first act is something called the hook. The hook is basically a technique where the movie does something right from the beginning to grab you and pull you into it. So for example, Guardians of the Galaxy starts with Star-Lord. We don't know anything about who he is, but he's at this kind of temple and he's going to steal what is one of the Infinity Stones. We don't know that. But how he goes into the temple, that whole sequence of him going in there, we see him put on his headphones and the cassette player, and he starts dancing to, Come and Get Your Love. Come and get your love is very indicative of how the movie is going to play out. It gives us some tonality, it gives us a look into him as a character. We get to see right out of the gate, kind of what we're in store for. And so that would be a perfect example of what a hook should do in a film. And again, this can be applied to any different genres of film. It doesn't have to be one particular thing. And probably the most important thing in the first act is what a lot of people call the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the event or the occurrence or whatever you want to call it that forces the main character, the protagonist, into the rest of the story. Because without the inciting incident, they would just kind of be chilling, by themselves. So for example, in Wonder Woman, we see the inciting incident when Diana meets Steve Trevor. Up till this point, we've seen Diana on Themyscira, we've seen the Amazonian women, we've kind of seen their culture, their world, and when Steve Trevor arrives on the island, all of that changes. And it forces Diana to want to go out into the world of men and pursue Ares, the god of war. And that kind of sets the stage for Wonder Woman. Act 2. So Act 2 contains the largest part of the story in any film. If you break down any movie that you've ever watched, the biggest chunk I can guarantee you will fall into Act 2. Act 2 does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of storytelling. A good way to think of Act 2 is actually to split it into 2 acts itself, which is why sometimes you will see 4 and 5 act structure of a film. But it's easy just to think of the second act is this really big piece of pie that you cut into. But Act 2 contains a lot of stuff. So kind of usually in the first half we get the introduction of the subplot, if there's a subplot that ties into the main story. We get the beginning of the character arcs. We kind of see like how the characters are going to start to develop, primarily the protagonist. We get to see what's going on in their world. This would also be the spot where if you're looking at more of like a literary graph, like I showed at the beginning, this would be where you see all the rising action. It's all these different things that are happening to propel the story to its climax. The second part of Act 2 is generally where we see complications in the main plot. So maybe the protagonist did something, they thought they had overcome the villain or the problem, and then, it backfires on them. Or maybe this is like in a romantic comedy, we see the couple's been working out so nicely together, they're finally together, and then they have a conflict or they have a misunderstanding, and now they're not talking. This is also where we will see in movies where a character despairs and starts to lose hope. They don't know what to do. So for example, in Star Wars Rogue One. Rogue One is Star Wars, sorry. Come on, what are you doing, man? Get in the game! So in Rogue One, we see this second half, this kind of like dark time of realization, which a lot of storytellers categorize as like the dark night of the soul, where the character is at like the lowest point and all the things seem stacked against them. We see this point when Jin and the crew go to find Galen, and he ends up being killed. Spoilers, I hope you've seen it by now. And they return back to the Rebel Alliance, and the Rebel Alliance votes that they don't have enough tactile information to actually try to invade and get the plans. At this point, all hope seems lost. Jin has physically lost something, she's emotionally lost something, and it seems like there's no hope. But that would be the lowest point. And that's what the second part of your second act wants to do. It wants to drive home this point of desperation, of what do we do next? And the choice that will be made coming out of that desperation is a choice that usually it can't be reversed. Things will never be the same after this person makes this choice or that goes to this place or does whatever. Also in the second part of Act 2 is where we can see people giving possible solutions to what we could do, some foreshadowing of like how the film will actually end, like the plot. And typically speaking, as we see in this literary diagram that I talked about at the beginning, the second part of Act 2 is where we see the climax. Generally, there can be some exceptions, there always will be exceptions, but generally 90% of the time it occurs in Act 2. Act number 3! So finally, we come to Act 3. Now Act 3, when you look at the literary chart, has only two parts to it, which is the rising, not the rising action. We already talked about that earlier, man. Get in the game. Generally, the third act only has a couple things. When we look at it in literary terms, we've got the falling action and then we have the resolution. The falling action basically is tying up a lot of the loose ends that the film addressed earlier. So this would be like wrapping up subplots, or what are the consequences of this climactic action? Was somebody killed? How is that going to affect other characters? Did somebody change in a way that will make them different, going back to their homeland? Lots of different things like that. And the resolution actually kind of gives us closure to that. So it can be as in Lord of the Rings, when finally the hobbits return to the Shire. Or in Harry Potter, for example, when Harry finally defeats Voldemort, we have that final resolution. So if you can incorporate these elements into your storytelling as you go out and make films, even if it's a short film, every story can be broken down into these three chunks. Anyway guys, that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope some of this content will help you in crafting great stories for your films. If you have ideas or thoughts about your own opinions on story structure or stuff that you've learned, please let me know down in the comments. As always guys, you can follow me on the social media at CatInTheHat49 on Twitter, and you can check out more of our content on the blog at thatrealperspective.blogspot.com. Until next time, Cat in the Hat out.